Hi, I want to welcome everyone to the first panel in the Revolution is Not a One-Time Series event, a project organized by Lola Olufemi, Sarah Shin, and myself in collaboration with Arika and generously hosted by Silver Press. And I'd like to hand it over first off to our esteemed moderator, Akwugo Emejulu.
Esteemed, wow, I'm so fancy. Right, well, hello, welcome, good afternoon and good evening to the literally hundreds and I think perhaps 1,000 people, which is just insane, that are on this call this evening. So I'm just so delighted to welcome you guys to this fantastic conversation about abolitionist feminist futures. My name is Akwugo Emejulu. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick, and I am facilitating this conversation this afternoon stroke evening, depending on where in the world you are. And before I introduce this amazing lineup of speakers, I want to just go over some housekeeping really quickly. Firstly, unlike the first conversation that I think some of you guys were on and that we had, this conversation is being recorded. So if you do not want to be seen, I would suggest that you turn off your video. That also makes sure, that also helps to keep the call stable. But if you want to keep your video on, you might want to change your username, your screen name, so that's not shown in the video. So that's the first thing just to bear in mind. So if you don't want to be seen, if you don't want to be seen, you better get together because you're being recorded. That's the first thing. The second thing is we have simultaneous captioning for the visually impaired or for those who just need to have a bit more time of reading on the screen. All you need to do is go down to your menu page and you'll see closed caption and you could turn on your subtitles there, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So that's something just to bear in mind for you guys. Just very quickly about timings, this event is going to be around about 90 minutes. What we'll do is we'll have a panel conversation for about 60, maybe 70 minutes. Then we're going to take a short break of about 5 minutes, a little kind of comfort break, nip to the loo, get a glass of water, and then we will reconvene to take questions from the audience. You'll note that you guys are muted and you'll stay muted throughout this call in order to reduce background noise and disruption, particularly for people who are entering the call late. And so if you do have questions for the panel, please use the chat function and submit your question via the chat. Sarah Shin will, as part of Silver Press and one of the co-organizers, will collate your questions and send me a document with all of your questions. Please know from the beginning, we are not going to be able to answer all of your questions. And through the power of my being the chair, which is either good or bad, I'm going to select what I think are the most interesting and relevant questions to put to the panel. So that, and then we're hopefully going to all wrap up at 8:30, well, 8:30 UK time at least. And so we'll be in and out of here and we will go forward into glory. The other thing I just wanted to say is I'd just like to thank the number of people who were involved in organizing this. Thank you to Silver Press, thank you to Arika, thank you to Sarah Shin, Lola Olufemi, Che Gossett, NTS Radio, for organizing this event and bringing us all together. And please know that this is the first of 4 events throughout the month of August. So if you didn't get a chance to go on holiday, you're trapped at home, you have us here every Monday in August, which is very exciting. And Lola is going to come in to talk to you guys a bit about the next set of conversations at the end of this call. So stick around to hear more about that. So before I kick off, I just to the panel and introduce the panel, I just wanted to say a couple of things about Audre Lorde and my relationship to her, because I think it's actually, well, I don't know if my relationship is actually all that interesting, but I just thought it's important to kind of think about the argument that she was making and which this, this panel discussion. I'm back. Oh Lord, God help us in terms of technology. Everything went so well last time, but I'm back, it's okay. So I was just in the middle of like ranting about Audre Lorde, so I'll be quick about it. My apologies for that. I'll just say very quickly, what was really important about her to kind of my coming to Black consciousness and my understanding of Black feminism was that she was able to articulate in her article such a clear understanding of my alienation from what I thought feminism was. because I didn't get it. Up until that point, I was like, yeah, I get it. Women are unequal, blah, 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 blah. But wasn't speaking to my interests, my needs, and my life experience. And that what this essay did was very clearly articulate the nature of the problem, of which mainstream white feminism supports and enforces white supremacy. And I think this is so important. And I think this is so crucial in terms of setting the terms of the conversation for our discussion today. And if you'll permit me, I'll just read a short passage from her essay, which I think is actually really important to our conversation about abolitionist feminism. Because for me, the main thing to take away from her essay is not just her searing indictment of white middle-class feminism, but also her envisioning of a future, another possible future, which is grounded in community, and it's grounded in care, and it's grounded in an idea of solidarity across difference. So if you'll permit me, I'll just read very quickly, but I'm also super old, and I'm one of those people who has to take off my glasses to read something very small. So just so you know. All right, she says this, quote, "Those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support." And I think that leads us incredibly well to our conversation today about abolition and abolitionist feminism. Because what is so important about this essay and this conversation is that it gives us a staging ground to imagine the future. And what's so important in thinking about abolitionist feminism is that you must put it in conversation, and must put it into context of a broader, radical Black feminist intellectual tradition. So if you only get to abolitionist feminism, you're forgetting about a whole other part of the tradition that abolition is an essential, a key part, but doesn't quite make sense unless you have a conversation also about fugitivity and fortuity. And so we're going to bind these ideas together to try to rethink the future. And so with that, let me introduce our panel today. Gail Lewis is Reader Emerita of Psychosocial Studies in the Department of Psychosocial Studies, School of Social Sciences, History and Philosophy. She joined the department in 2013 and was assistant dean between 2015 and 2017. Her political subjectivity was fashioned in the generative cauldron of Black feminist and anti-imperialist activism. She was a member of Brixton Black Women's Group and a founder member of OAD, the Organization of Women of Asian and African Descent. She trained as a psychodynamic psychotherapist and as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist at the Tavistock and Portman Clinic. She's a visiting senior scholar at the Gender Department at the London School of Economics. She holds an honorary doctorate from the University of Essex, Tavistock and Portman Clinic. She has published on social policy, feminism, and psychodynamics of organization, always attending the processes of racialized gendering. Next, we have a veteran of the infamous Stonewall riots, former sex worker and survivor of Arika State Prison, transgender elder and activist Miss Major has fought for over 40 years to create visibility and equity for trans women of color. Miss Major has built a global legacy of activism that is rooted in her own experiences and will continue to pave the way for transgender women of color, particularly those who have survived incarceration and police brutality. Zoe Samudzi is a writer and PhD candidate in medical sociology at the University of California, San Francisco. Her research analyzes German colonialism, colonial biomedicine, and the genocide against the Herero and Nama and Sans peoples in Nambia, 1904 to 1908, and its scientific afterlife. Along with William C. Anderson, she is co-author of As Black as Resistance, Finding the Conditions of Our Liberation. She is currently a research fellow with the Political Research Association. Hortense Spillers is a Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt professor in the English department at Vanderbilt University, where she has been on faculty since 2006. She is the editor, along with Marjorie Priest, of Conjuring, Black Women, Fiction, and Literary Tradition, and Comparative American Identities, Race, Sex, and Nationality in the Modern Text. She published a collection of essays, Black, White, and in Color, Essays on American Literature and Culture, which spans the breadth of her professional interests in African American culture and history. Folks, you guys are in for a treat. This is the real deal. All these living legends in the room, we got to make sure we give them their flowers. That's what's one of the key lessons for all of us in this. So let's get started, please. I'm going to ask questions in reverse order and start with Hortense Spillers. So Hortense, please, can you help us try to make sense of this idea of what does Black feminist futurity mean to you?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. What does Black feminist futurity mean? Yeah, I've been thinking about that quite a lot, and I think it means it's not mysterious or anything too complex or too complicated, and I think in certain ways, it's not even the future. I think in some ways, it's where we are and where we've always been. And I suppose that raises interesting questions about time. But as I see future, it's always something that is never quite unknown, though it's revealed in a way that might seem futuristic or something that one doesn't know. I think of the future as something that is always with us because it is an ideal. It's something that we're always attempting to achieve. And I think from that point of view, Black feminism is probably the single most potential or most open project that I can think of. And I think that's true because so much of it is unknown in terms of cultures, communities, grammars, languages in the post-colonial world, in the world that is still unfolding. From one point of view, I suppose you could say our future is closed if you think about the difficulties of, say, climate change and whether or not life on the planet is still sustainable. And there's a great deal of pessimism about that possibility. On the other hand, I think if you think of the end of things as we currently know them as another kind of opening or beginning, then we're somewhere that is full of potential and possibility. And that's the way I read Black feminist future, Black feminist possibility.
So this idea then of kind of the future is always with us because we're always trying to make it and remake it, as well as even though things might look bleak, that's also another kind of exit or opening in a way.
Yeah, okay. That's right. Because I think when we speak of end, it is the West thinking about end that it names the end, right? You know, THE in caps, but that's not the only time, as we know, and it's not the only human possibility. And in some ways, that's what our conversations have been about the last many decades, different times, different spaces, different human possibilities, so that the end that we're always talking about as the end need not be the end, if that makes sense. I mean, it could well be other worlds made possible because the one that has been ruined has finally collapsed. Mm. And we're no longer in a space of emergence. You know, you're no longer in the old world, but the new one is not quite here. Somewhere in an interstitial space. I think that might be where we are now. And so much depends on whether or not the values that Black feminists hold dear can become the values of larger numbers of people. And that is truly making the world safe for multiple populations, and not just some populations, but multiple populations. So I think that that is the feminist future that we are attempting to claim now, and that is making the world safe for many populations, many peoples, many possibilities.
That's great. Thank you so much. Zoe, can you talk to us about what Black feminist futurity means to you?
I really love what Dr. Spillers just mentioned about this idea of the future as the present, and something that I think about a lot and kind of playing with time is this idea that we are already ancestors, that we are in the present, growing and expanding the knowledges that, the people who come after us will be building upon. And I think the beauty of speculating futurities is so rich and ripe to me, because it feels like this meeting of like Black feminist care ethics with this abolitionist impulse and effort to destroy. But abolition isn't just about the destruction of oppressive forms in the present, right? It's about, and to kind of, to riff off of the words of so many other abolitionists who said it better, it's about creating the conditions that would render these imprisoning systems obsolete and unnecessary in the future. It's about, trying to imagine and trying to actualize a world that is safe for, trans self-determination and sex worker autonomy and Black motherhood and transformative justice and all of these other ways of understanding land and rematriating land and restoring Indigenous stewardship and everything. And because there's no blueprint for this, there's no blueprint for the future. All of this feels like this scientific methodology where we're constantly kind of speculating and experimenting and continuously refining our approach, because, abolition is not an end point. It's this continuous, into the future, into forever, this ongoing praxis of care and destruction that has to take time, and it necessarily occurs in this kind of plurality of times and spaces and places, because because the praxis has to be so kind of particular and specific to context. I think that futurity most importantly means a space for multiplicity, and yeah, the practice of tending to and growing these multiplicities is really exciting to think about, I think.
So that's really interesting. So I love this idea of, you didn't say it in these terms, but I often think about this idea of living the future now and bringing and walking with our ancestors and bringing the past into the present, about, collapsing space-time, right? In these very practical ways. It sounds kind of esoteric, but then you're like, well, actually, what we can do is learn from the past and imagine new futures. And that's a way of kind of doing this process, which I think is really interesting. And I love that idea. Part of kind of the radical Black feminist ethics is also thinking of ourselves as already ancestors. So that's really interesting to think about it in those terms, that securing the future in those ways for future generations is really interesting. Ms. Major, can you talk to us a wee bit about what Black feminist futures futurity means to you? Oh, you're still muted. Okay, let me unmute you. Just a second.
Okay.
There we go.
All right. Hello. Okay, now give me a question again.
What does Black feminist futurity, what do Black feminist futures mean to you?
Well, you know, the thing is, I think a Black feminist movement is how it's going to be when we get into that space. You know, it will be, say, trans women leading some group or another. It will be a time when that sort of feeling that you get when you believe in something and you want to see it grow to something, it is the view of everybody will be given a chance to see who they are, to expound on that, to grow, you know. It's not, I think, a point of view that is just that given to that set of people. You know, it will be inclusive of everybody. And that is what is important, that everybody gets a chance to live according to what they want to live and to flourish in that group, you know. Yeah, that's fluidity to me.
No, I love that idea of having to kind of set the ground. You know, we have to, in order to imagine the future, we have to imagine in these very practical terms of who's included, who's excluded, how can people live freely in this new world, in this new space? Because that's such an important part of kind of imagining the future, is being incredibly practical about how to make that happen. And I love that idea of thinking about it as a harvest. The kind of work that we do now will kind of have this outcome that we can that we can kind of reap the benefits in many ways in terms of this kind of radical freedom.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Oh, I agree wholeheartedly with that, because that is what we're going for. We're trying to build a safer world, a better place to live, so that everybody, people like me, and some of the people who are listening, can live a chance to grow and to change this shit. You know, be who you are, you know. That's important. That's important. It's a work of being who you are.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Ms. Major. Gail Lewis, can you talk to us about what does Black feminist futurity mean to you?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. And already I'm kind of learned so much by what I've already heard. So it's just brilliant. And I think I would echo the sense that a Black feminist futurity is about another kind of temporality, because it is concurrently the past and the future, but layered in through a kind of commitment to a different ethical now, a different kind of space of an ethical sociality now, that we live it as Black feminists because we live, well, we attempt to live, and we hold each other to account to live and practice differently in order that we can draw on the ancestral inheritance and further it, because we are also ancestors and we owe an obligation to the future. So there's something that seems to me profoundly about a different kind of, a different way of thinking the relation between now and what we aim for and what we can't even imagine, but we sense can be different, and the past that gives us the past is the stars through which we navigate our steerage towards the future, it seems to me. And that past is multiple, of course, all the different multiple struggles, the multiple ways in which we've recorded or not recorded those struggles, but also the visions, exactly what it would mean. And I know that I'm standing here in my 60-something years because of the steerage given to me by Black feminists, whether it was called that or not, action all over the world. And my responsibility is to try to garner that into a set of practices to leave for the younger generations to carry that forward. So I guess I think of Black feminist futurity as a kind of assembly of steerage that has a different kind of temporal package within it. But most importantly, because it's about care, it says that our struggle is not trying to get into the normativities through which the social is currently arranged so that we can become good gendered subjects in the image of white femininities, or good class subjects in the image of a kind of bourgeois man, white man in that sense, or even good kind of sexual subjects with a kind of domesticated gay and lesbianness in the image of heteropatriarchy. All of those things I think are conjured by this assemblage called Black feminist futurity. So there's much there. It's rich and it's complex, but it's demanding too. It requires of us to try and live the ethical practices of care that we feel Black feminism speaks to.
That's wow. And I'll just say just very briefly that it's the one and only time that I've heard anyone use the term assemblages in a way that is like not pretentious and not horrifying.
Sorry.
So first of all, thank you so much for that. So the STSers know what's up, those bastards. Anyway, that's another. But I love what kind of connects all of what you guys are saying in terms of what the Black feminist futurity means. There's something important here about radical care, about ethics, about possibilities, which I think are so interesting, right? About, you know, what you live the future now by opening up possibilities for yourself, for others, but also for those who will come after us. But I love this idea, Gail, that you were saying about, but also this is an immense responsibility. And this also links to what Zoe was saying about if we think of ourselves as ancestors, then this is a huge responsibility that we carry in order to try to secure a different kind of future that doesn't reinscribe the old social orders. Do you want to say a little bit more about that, Gail?
Well, the current social orders, and I think it will emerge as we consider some of these questions around abolition, because abolition is at one level a vast terrain. It invites us to undo everything as we reimagine everything. But I think it's just the idea that we might come to later. I suppose it's the difference between a politics of claim, where on the one hand, we might say we claim against the state for, I hate to use the word at this time, particularly in the UK context, to claim for inclusion. Yeah, we make a claim against the state that has kept us out in all sorts of ways. And there may be a moment where we need to do that, I guess. For example, for those of you who are not in the UK, people forgive me, but there's something called the Windrush scandal, which is where the generation who mythically announced the Black presence in Britain arrived in 1948, in June 1948, Black people from the Caribbean, to come and work, employment. And many of those people, the children who came, traveled on their mother's passports. And they traveled on their mother's passports, and they're now 60, 70, late 50s, and they're being denied access to all the joys of British social citizenship. So they can't get healthcare, they can't get social benefits, they don't even have the right to work, say, even though they've been doing all that since they were 6, 7, 8 years old. and they've been working in, etc. And it's called the Windrush scandal. Now, it's so apparent that that is, if you like, an example of the social death that Patterson talks about as a marker of the legacies of Atlantic enslavement. Our mothers cannot pass on to us something, any rights to citizenship, for example. And so in relation to Windrush, we would make a claim against the state and say those people need to be able to have the benefits that they've paid into at one level, yeah? So we'd want that. So there's that kind of claim. But our claim as Black feminists who are thinking about learning from the past and about a different kind of future sociality is not about a claim for inclusions in the state under those terms of citizenship, because they are always about our positioning as minor, as not fully developed as full human, a diminishment of our full personhood. That's kind of citizenship is always a diminishment of our full personhood. And that's not the claim we want. We don't want to claim for the terms of gender normativity that have excluded us anyway. We don't want inclusion in that. We don't want to expand the current capacities, is the point. We are visioning something different that we don't even necessarily know the shape of yet, but we gesture towards it because we sense it with all of our senses, with our very body's capacity to sense things. We sense something is different. So it's in that sense I was really referring to it, I think, Akwugo.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Sorry
so
if that was
much.
a bit long-winded.
No. We always want to hear the good stuff from you, Gail Lewis. So, but that also leads us very helpfully onwards to the next question, especially about this idea of moving into something that we don't quite know what that might be. So moving into this moment of ambivalence. So the next question, and I'll start again with, I'll start with Zoe this time. Zoe, can you talk to us a little bit about what the relationship is between Black feminism and fugitivity?
Yeah, I can try my best. I mean, I think about fugitivity as this rejection of any kind of border that would enclose and govern Blackness, right? Like it's a recognition of these ideologies and conditions that shape and inform Black materiality, Black existence, while of course refusing to accept these like forced and imposed limitations of what could or could ever be. And I guess to maybe give an example, like a more concrete example, because it feels like such a hard question to answer in the abstract. I think like the heuristic and the method and the framework that I use and I think about most often is like in Black visual practice, especially, you know, Tina Camp's method of like listening to images, which was really transformative to me. And it completely reframed the way that I think about like looking at photography, the way that I think about approaching the archive, and then obviously the way that I think about just trying to conceptualize and consider Black life in general. And specifically, you know, she describes this method of archival engagement. And I think for me, the most striking example is when she is looking at these like kind of classically racist anthropological images of these indigenous South African women. And we might like look at the pictures and be like, yeah, that's like classic apartheid, classic, you know, visual landscaping of coloniality. But she talks about like, she zooms in on like the muscular tension in the faces of the women who are in the photographs. And she describes them as, you know, holding something back or keeping something in reserve. So even though these are images that are used for these racist classifications, there is still like a quiet self-fashioning. There's still like a quiet, like practice of Black indigeneity, of Black making that you can only really see if you pay very close attention to those images. And what I really have learned from her and the way that I'm thinking about fugitivity differently now is that it demands this attentiveness to quiet, this respect for like the sovereignty of quiet. And it really forces this shift and this slowness in how we observe, and so how we read and how we write and how we communicate. And because moving slowly takes time, and coordinating across geographies takes time, it becomes this really powerful bridge to abolition, because it becomes about the creating of sustainable networks, of new sustainable networks outside of these socialities that white supremacy says are the only ones that we are allowed to occupy and the only ones that we are allowed to gain legibility through. Fugitivity becomes, about both the seen and opaque makings and of Black life, and that's what abolition is so much to me.
No, it's really interesting. Thank you so much for that. And just to say to everyone, I sent speakers kind of 5 questions that I was like, ha, 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 I don't have to answer this, but I really am interested in what they have to say about it. And these were actually very difficult questions. So I appreciate it, you guys. And so I think that's really interesting and important, this focus on silence and quietude. I think that's actually very interesting. And what I love about Camp's work is, her focus on kind of a Black feminist futurist grammar, which I think is so interesting, right? And so her focus on kind of hesitation and ambivalence, but it's in reading, it's in that kind of quiet, difficult reading of these images in ways that we can kind of uncover and excavate this other way of doing and being that can't be captured by apartheid or kind of the gender binary or all of these things. It opens up all these kinds of different possibilities. So Ms. Major, can I bring you in here? Can you talk to us a little bit about what you think the relationship is between Black feminism and fugitivity? And if you don't use these terms and you're like, get out of here with all this, please tell me that, and I'm very happy to get out of here with all that. But can you just talk to me about, and this conversation about the relationship between Black feminism and fugitivity and what the relationship is to abolition would be really helpful to hear from you.
Well, I guess the important thing to remember about that is prisons should not exist at all. There is no reason for them to devastate families like they have for years. And in a sense, it builds on this hierarchy that they have. For instance, with the President of the United States. That ignorance and that nonchalantness comes at a cost that we paid, and they don't recognize that. So it becomes a matter of what is important to the people, and they must survive. And the best way to do that is to come up with another solution that would be easier and less autocratic, we'll say, in order to have it be open and free, because that's the only way that we can survive and make it. This system that they have is so, detrimental to the existence of what we are and who we are. And it doesn't take into account the varied number of people that are in this, So I would say that, the best way to go about this is you have to abolish that. You have to reduce that pressure that is on us, and then give us a chance to explode them and get them out of the way, because they're standing in the way,
It's so interesting, and I think this is really important that we kind of keep this grounded in the practical politics in terms of thinking about these ideas of just this seemingly radical, seemingly simple but radical idea that quite simply prison should not exist. Because this idea of that it's not just, it's detrimental to the very existence of Black people, of queer folks, of all the rest of it. And it's trying to think about that idea, trying to keep open this future of how can we live in a society in which prison does not exist. I think this is exactly right. And so I think this is incredibly helpful in keeping us kind of grounded in the practical everyday of how do we translate these ideas of abolition into kind of a practical politics. So I appreciate that. So thank you very much, Ms. Major. Hortense Spillers, can you talk to us a little bit about the relationship between Black feminism and fugitivity, and then that relationship to abolition? Where is Hortense? Oh, you're muted. Let me unmute you.
Yeah.
There we go.
There we go. Okay. I want to go back to something that I think Zoe was talking about earlier. I'm interested in the title of Tina Camp's book, Listening to Images, and the extent to which the title itself is a kind, poses, figuratively speaking, an impossibility, right? And I think the rhetoricians would call that an oxymoron, or the poets would call it synesthesia. We associate listening with hearing. We don't associate it with the visual. So that putting those two things together brings about an interesting conceptual clash. And I think that's what happens when we think Black feminism and fugitivities, right? Because what Black feminism does with fugitivity is turn it into something useful, or turn it into something that is full of paradox and possibility, or thinking of things that don't go together and bringing them together. And I think that's what the notion of both fugitivity, the way Black intellectuals use it, and Black feminism as we think about it, that's what those things do, right? I mean, they imagine a world that is a kind of impossibility from the official point of view, so that what they are trying to bring to stand is a world that certainly does not exist and has barely been imagined. And yeah, I think that's the relationship between the fugitive, or the unscripted, or the text that's not quite exhausted. Perhaps it hasn't even been written, in relationship to a temporality that's open. The thing about abolition, and I wanted to ask a question about abolition, because when I think abolition, I think formality, or something that is proffered on the other end of which is a passive receiver. And I was wondering, why not the word emancipation? In other words, I was wondering if abolition was doing some work that was particular to the kind of activity we want to imagine when we think about the fugitive, or when we think about future, or when we think about Black feminist ideals. And so if somebody could address that, I would be happy to hear it. The difference between the abolitional and the emancipatory.
Oh, that's very helpful, Hortense. I will hold that question. Because I want to first get Gail Lewis in here to answer this question. And then I think Lola is on the call. So Lola, as who I believe identifies herself as an abolitionist feminist, maybe we can get her in to answer your question, which I think will be quite interesting and important. And if someone else wants to kind of pop in as well, that would be very helpful. But Gail Lewis, please, can you talk to us about the relationship between Black feminism, fugitivity, and abolition?
Yeah, thank you. I just would like to refer back to something that Zoe said first of all in referring to Tina Camp's work, and about the I think you said, Zoe, the attentiveness to quiet, and it made me think. It really struck a chord with me. It was beautiful, and it kind of, I calmed a moment, but it made me think about how part of what this is on the table, that we put on the table through our discussions and through our visions, is the need to abolish capitalist time and all the ways in which there's a capture in that, and that the slowness, the slowing down is also in some senses an act of at least pushing against the dictates of capitalist time and its mode of capture. So just in my mind. But I was thinking, I mean, in a way, when you sent us these questions, Akwugo, I was thinking, but there isn't a relationship between Black feminism and fugitivity, because Black feminism is fugitive in the sense that it's a terrain of outlawness against all of the kind of categorical nominations that classify personhoods, subjects. You know, we refuse them all because one, they don't have room for us. And I go back to my point about claim, but we're not claiming a space. We don't want them to be more capacious. We want them abolished. And in that abolition, but at the same time, we work under the radar of them a lot of the time. Think of the work of all of the wonderful artist curational work that's going on in Britain at the moment, that absolutely is at the cutting edge of declarations of forms of Black feminist imagination, and open up the space for us as we kind of come into contact with that work, a space for us to know ourselves differently. When I think of the work that, I don't know, Barbie Asante does, Rehana Zaman, etc., I have a capacity to know myself differently as a Black queer woman in London, in the city into which I was born, where a certain set of expectations were supposed to determine the routes that I took. And now I come up against this work, and still, even now, I can know myself differently. And that's because it's the space of a Black feminist fugitivity, it seems to me, because they offer us ways to at least get under the radar of the nominal categories through which we're supposed to know ourselves and direct our behavior. And that feels really, really important to me. And I was also thinking, if it's okay to just say, I don't know why, when I read this question, I thought about in the 1980s, maybe late 70s, 80s, 90s, all of that battle for the airwaves, the ways in which, you know, all over London, especially in South London, you'd see these aerials going up because it was the pirate radio stations rejecting the BBC's control on who could play what. And all of the Black music across the range of Black musical form that was illegal, unlicensed, but up on the aerials because people would run across the rooftops and put the aerials up and declare Black presence, masculine, feminine, in between, none of those, declare Black presence through the music, through the sounds, and call up where we came from and new forms, and make a kind of Blackness in Britain. I'm not going to call it Black British. It doesn't belong to the nation state called Britain. It was a Blackness in Britain through these musical forms. There was a fugitivity, it seemed to me, that is echoed by the Black feminism that was also arising in those moments. As we were traveling the rooftops, if you like, at least the symbolic rooftops of saying, this feminist work, don't belong to us, it's nothing to do with us. This anti-racist work don't belong to us because it doesn't know how to think about the lived experience of women on the bus stop, even though you're always calling up about your mama. You know, so there was a way in which we traveled the rooftops, and we traveled the streets, and we traveled the meeting rooms, and we did this kind of work that was a Black feminism, but that was both fugitive. It was fugitive in the sense that it was working to a form of Blackness, always reinventing itself. So that's why I think, in a sense, Black feminism is a kind of fugitivity.
Oh, okay.
Sorry,
so
I'm
I was
done.
waiting for you. I was like literally on the edge of my seat going, a kind of fugitivity? I was like, okay, I got it. But Gail, first of all, thank you so much. That is so interesting. I think people have really appreciated your kind of highlighting the pirate radio as well, because it's that kind of, because it's that idea of working on the margins and on the edges, and in doing so, you can become yourself, which I think is very, very interesting. And I love this idea of thinking about Black feminism, Black feminist fugitivity as kind of a form of kind of Blackness always never settled, and always in dialogue and in debate, and always changing, that there is no end point, but it's just this constant reinvention of things, which I think is super interesting. Folks, it is 5 to 8. And so what I want to do is actually skip one of the questions so we can get to what I would like to kind of get to a few of the more practical questions, which I think might be very interesting. So we're going to skip to question 4, and I want to start with Ms. Major, please, and ask, are the master's house and tools the same as when Audre Lorde was writing in 1984? So what's the same, what's changed, and how might we dismantle the master's house? Ms. Major?
Wow. Well, I guess to start with, the master's house, he really is the master of who we are, because that gives him way too much power in the fact that he is in control. And as far as what he's got in there, he has the same things that he has always had. He has fear, he has trepidation, he has questioning, and we can storm his place and take those things and squash them, because he doesn't control who we are, what we want out of life. And it is playing on, there's been years that we have had rallies and groups of people, but it's always been Black people that were there in the rallies and standing up for who and what we want. And this year, it seems as if it has shifted, because now there are white people in the groups rooting for us. And if we're going to take over his house and really turn it around for us, then we have to rely on the white people that are there with us, because they know what he is about, you know. And as much as I don't approve of that, it is an avenue that we must partake in order to see a change. And that is important, that we see a change. You know?
Yes, sorry. No, that's very interesting. I like I love the idea of really taking seriously the idea of the master's house is built by fear and terror, but there's always agency. So he doesn't control us, and she doesn't control us. There's always a space for self-sovereignty, which I think is actually really important. And this has been like the great debate within feminism for literally 100 years of the question of coalition politics between Black, white, and brown women. So like, yes, it's important to kind of, to raise this, it's incredibly difficult to resolve this, I think.
Yeah. Is.
Do you want to just speak very briefly about your experiences of trying to build coalitions across difference and what, how helpful or how realistic that is?
Well, what I had started to do is to have a place where the girls of the colors or gender nonconforming meet here and get a chance to relax and forget about the things that are a problem to them. And then in that way, when they go back to the situation, they're ready to fight for it, to stand up and say, I'm not taking it anymore, And in that sense, I feel that I'm contributing to their doing this so that it continues on and goes further than it has been. So with this pandemic that's now surging through the country, there is a chance to select a few of them, and give them an opportunity to learn, to relax, and then charge ahead. So I look, I'm hoping. Yeah.
Ms. Major, that's brilliant. And I guess I often think about, so this model of, yes, having this space, having this house, I just think is so important in terms of, where Black women and gender non-conforming folks and femmes can all kind of get together outside of the kind of the ugly world of kind of coalition building. And I always talk about, anyone who knows me says, I always talk about Barbara Smith's famous essay on coalition politics. And she talks about the idea that the coalition is not your home. The coalition is the place where you do politics. Your home is somewhere else. And your home is that place for nurturing and sustaining, but you can't stay at home. You have to go out into the coalition. But it's so important to have both of those spaces. And I think, that's absolutely, and I think we oftentimes forget that we think the coalition is the home, and boy, it sure is.
It really is.
It sure is.
It is, yeah.
Hortense Spillers, can you talk to us a little bit about what's changed and what's the same in terms of the master's house and the master's tools?
I wonder what's changed. I think everything has changed, but in some ways, nothing has changed. I've always sort of disagreed with that essay by Audre Lorde, whom I really honor. And I've often thought it would have been wonderful to have had a conversation with her about that particular metaphor, because I've always thought, well, will the tools of the master's house, can they be dismantled with the master's tools? And in some ways, I've thought those are the only tools that can dismantle the master's house, are those tools, and that they are not his tools in particular anyway, and that they are no more the master's tools than they are mine, and that I must particularly go after the master's house with his tools. And I think maybe, to go back to a point that somebody made earlier about how difficult it is to talk about these things abstractly, in some cases, I want us to think about the fate of the university the last 4 decades. the university in Britain, the university in the United States, the university in Canada. And I name those places in particular because those universities would be associated with the master's house, or they would be thought of as elaborations of the master's house. And what I would submit is that the university of the 21st century is not the university that I entered as a graduate student at Brandeis University in 1968, when Audre Lorde was alive and well and writing, and Barbara Smith was alive and well, and it was a few years before Kambahi and so forth, maybe 15 years before All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave, and the births of Black feminist theory and praxis. The university of those years is not the university today, and it is precisely because the population of those universities changed. The demographic changed about 1968. Somebody else went to the university and made it a different space, so that it became the university that is not the ideal that we all imagine, but it is a lot closer to the ideal that we imagine today than it was in 1968. And I think that's because of the presence of Black people and people of color. And that happened because we were playing around with the master's tools and discovering ways that those tools could be altered to fit our hands and our purposes. So that's why I both quarrel with that particular use of the metaphor at the same time that I understand precisely what Audre Lorde had in mind. So from that point of view, we're still talking about dismantlement. And I think that's not a work that's going to be finished in another day or two. I think it's work that is going to go on for a while. But I think we are a lot closer than we were, precisely because one of the grounds on which we chose to stand was the ground of the university, or the place where, or one of the places where the master said, "You have no business here anyway. This is not your space." I think we've made it our space, and increasingly so. So that's sort of the way I read that, as a kind of, well, maybe an unintended paradox that Audre Lorde meant when she wrote that essay in the late 60s or early 70s. Maybe it was meant to be kind of paradoxical. But in any case, it's something that I would have loved to have argued with her about, and she was a great arguer.
That's very interesting. Hortense Villers, I sure appreciate your counterintuitive interpretation of this this essay, which I have not heard before, which is very interesting. Zoe, can I bring you in here to talk about whether the master's tools and house have changed, and also maybe you can also answer a little bit of Hortense Villers in terms of, oh, we should all use these tools. Take a seat at the table, dismantle all the rest of it.
Yeah, I think that what Dr. Spillers was talking about and reflecting on the evolution of the university is actually something that I think about a lot, you know, as a graduate student, as someone who is, you know, freshly on the job market and trying to think about exactly how I want to interact with the academy moving forward. And I think that one of the newer tools that has been developed by not only the academy, but by a number of institutions, is this really brilliant way of like absorbing and deploying critique. So I'm thinking about like the mainstreaming of abolition and the politics of representation. I'm thinking about like corporate activism and how companies that materially benefit from anti-Black oppression, which includes, of course, you know, university institutions, are making these statements about how Black Lives Matters and really kind of enticing people to participate and to assimilate their protest into systems, which I don't think is the same as necessarily like being in this in academia itself. I'm just thinking about kind of the relationship between like trying to exist and trying to make work in this neoliberal space, which often can require someone to police themselves. And I think about at the same time, you know, these campaigns of like, listen to Black women, because I worry and I often think, you know, that too much of the political push to amplify voices on margins, at least in the ways that some of these campaigns go about it, becomes a kind of capitalist currency in itself. I actually very much agree with this idea of learning how to mold tools into the shapes of our own hands so that we can deploy them. And also, you know, I kind of worry about what happens when abolition and some of these ideas, some of these like fugitive and whatever practices are like taken out of the realm of actual fugitive practices. You know, I've been seeing like, for example, like some of these takes on like critical fabulation, and I'm just like, I'm sorry, that's not, okay, I'm not gonna be precious about like someone else's work, but I'm just like, I don't know if that's what that is really. And I just, this is not a question that I know how to answer yet. This is one that I'm trying to figure out how to navigate as I'm trying to kind of grow these communities, and I'm trying to be in like good relations and develop these practices. But I just like, I often don't know how to work it without feeling that in order to exist in a space, like there has to be this abandonment of certain kind of political commitments that would be held much more explicitly, much more strongly outside of the space. So obviously there are like other instances of and other places where like the master's tools can be deployed much more militantly, much more loudly. But thinking about it from inside the academy, from inside the ivory tower, like I'm really kind of struggling with this.
Wow, okay. That's very interesting. I appreciate the ambivalence about your positioning in relation to this idea, and also, yeah, thinking about what it means to be an academic and thinking through these ideas, I think is very interesting. Gail Lewis, can you talk to us, please, about what's the same and what's changed in terms of the master's tools in-house?
What's changed? I'm not sure. I'm not sure in the big picture of things much has changed in the context in which I'm living, at least in Britain. I think in terms of the big script, you know, the big macro thing. And on the other hand, I think in terms of the resources available to challenge the master's tools, much has changed just by the character of our presence. Not our presence per se, but the character of our presence. It seems to me, I referred a bit to earlier, and really, we have a capacity to imagine ourselves differently in a way that is in an outlaw relation to the categories of inclusion that we're supposed to inhabit. But as ever, Hortense gets me thinking. And interestingly, what came in my mind listening to Hortense talk about her response to Audrey and the master's tools was from psychoanalytic practice actually, and the distinction that we make between psychoanalytic practice, which is an edifice of master toolery in some senses, and yet and it's the distinction we would make between what we might think of as the reassuring interpretation, the one that kind of says to the person that we're working with, yeah, I hear you, I feel you, let's explore this a little more. Yeah. And the mutative interpretation, the one that lands in a way that the analysand or the client or the patient or whatever we want to call them takes something, hears you in that interrelation that you are in the consulting room, in a way that they feel can enable them to shift, radically shift, fundamentally shift. And of course, you know, in that framework, it's the idea that the analyst has really understood. Well, we hold that bit as become the one who knows. Okay, so hold that for a moment. But there's something about a distinction between a kind of practice and relation and a dialogue in relation and a presence that says something has shifted because we are in the room together differently. So we are in the university spaces. So something may have happened then. Certainly the challenge, we're in the university spaces in the British context, and we are shouting very loudly about what's called the Black attainment gap, the ways in which Black and other students of colour are coming in and not exiting with the same level of degrees as their white counterparts, even though they entered with the same level of achievement. Okay, so this gap, and we're shouting about that. And the universities are, they tell us, attending to it. So something's happened, there is something that's happened. But that isn't a mutative interpretation. That isn't a kind of response and claim. It's the thing I was trying to make the point before. It's a claim against the university to do something about the disadvantages that are evidently going on by us being here, whilst we're here. Okay, even if there are some Black and of colour faculty, something is not happening that's right. And so there's change in the sense that we're there, but there's not change in the sense of any degree of so-called equality of outcome, because there isn't meant to be. That's not what the university is there for. It's about hitting the management of multiculturalism's policy of saying, you've entered, you have the opportunity, it's up to you to do with it as you will, and if you fail, the problem lies with you. But if we distinguish, and that we make a claim about that, but if we distinguish between that and say, coming back to capturing the sound waves and music, the declaration of we will have our musical presence, there was a kind of, we just did it because we were making a declaration about Blackness, and that put on the powers that be, the master's tools, or at least the master's house, if you like, a demand that said, we can't have you in the airwaves like this. We weren't trying to get their attention. We were providing music for each other. That's what we were doing, okay? but that it evokes a kind of response of demand, but you can't be here, so what can we do? We'll try and battle with you. Okay, in that way. But the demand is deal with us. This is blackness. This is black life declaring itself. We're not really interested in what you're doing. And in that sense, there's a capture of the tools to slip around the side of the master's house and say, we're not bothering with that. We're making, our attention is with each other. We're making sound and presence and visibility and feeling and emotion and touch for each other, not for the master's house. We're sidelining the master's house because in the master's house, as the university shows us, we can only go so far. We can't dismantle anything. We can't even dismantle the categories of blackness that are ones that deem us as wanting in some way, as lacking, as unable, or if one of or two of us do well, oh, you done well. Where did you grow up? Did you really? Oh, were you? Was that the white side of you, or did you go to a white school? Or in other words, if you achieve, it's because you're not really black. And maybe this is a particularly British incarnation of this. Maybe there's something particular, and we need to make the distinction between the British and the US form. But I don't think our presence in the universities here is an indication of us being able to really take hold of the master's tools and use them in our advantage in the way that taking the airwaves did. That's it.
Wow, oh my God, thank you. And I think that really speaks to a very interesting, the real transnational divide, because, you know, there is no tradition of, you know, the once Black radicals entering the university, creating Black studies and ethnic studies departments and courses and programs in order to try to do some sort of jujitsu in terms of using the master's tools in the house. You know, that tradition in the British case just does not exist. And so I think it's right to be a bit more skeptical. I myself am far more skeptical, and I'm genuinely surprised. But I haven't been in the American academic system for a very long time, but I am deeply, yeah, I'm unconvinced. I'm unconvinced. I'll just say that, because I think there's—
can I just, but I guess what—
I'll just say— sorry, just
one—
no, yeah, hold on just a second.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll just say very quickly, because we're meant to finish in 10 minutes, but I guess we're gonna have to go to kind of 20 to the hour, just so we can squeeze in some questions. So sorry, go ahead, Gail. Go ahead, Gail.
I guess it was just to say, I guess though, what's put on the table for us is the need, you know, we're talking about Black feminism as a need to take care and pay attention to detail and slow down. And one of the things that requires, I think, that was put on the table for us by Dr. Spillers is the need to pay attention to the difference that may occur by our entering into places that we were deemed not, where it's deemed that we're not supposed to enter. What is the difference? And we need to take account, we need to pay attention to that to try and think it through. That's what I've been called attention to. Sorry, I'm gone.
No, that's all good. No, please stay. That's great. Okay, folks, once again, as usual, because everyone is fabulous, we've kind of completely run over time and all the timings are slightly off, but only slightly off. And so what I'm hoping we can do now is take the promised and perhaps very much needed 5-minute break. I have by my watch, it is 8:22, and wherever you are, it's somewhere 22 minutes past the hour. Can you please come back at 27 minutes past the hour, wherever you are across the time zones? We'll take a short break and we'll be right back. Don't leave the call, just switch off your, mute your, well, you're already muted, maybe switch off your video and we will reconvene in 5 minutes. Okay, we'll see you soon. All right, oh, look at everyone back exactly at time. I love it. Everyone's video is turning back on again. Look at that. Everyone's so punctual. God bless you. This never happens in like, we were all together. Well, we should never go back to a conference, face-to-face conferences again. I'd have to be chasing you guys away from the coffee at this point. So this is incredible. All right, let's get to questions. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you. That was a pretty hardcore discussion. You guys have kind of like plowed through that like champions. And the text conversation has been very interesting. So I promise you, I will do my best to get through a number of these.
Of course, just about to leave, sorry.
Okay, I'm gonna try to get through as many of these questions as I can, but because folks are tired and it's almost already been 90 minutes, we might only take a few. So, so we'll kick off with Hortense Spiller's question too, and I'm gonna ask Che and Lola to kind of get on this conversation just very quickly, please. If you can unmute yourselves and turn on your cameras. And Hortense was asking about why abolition and what is the work that abolition does and why not use the term emancipation or emancipatory practices. So we'll take Lola first and then Che, and then we'll get to the other questions.
Yeah, I think this is a really excellent question, and I'm going to try my best to answer it from what I know I can say. But I think that the conversation around abolition in this specific moment is drawn from or emerges from a kind of constant cycle of Black death that we're seeing at the hands of the state and at the hands of the police. And what I don't necessarily think that there's a friction between those two words or concepts. I think that abolition is a kind of strategy that we use in the ongoing project of emancipation. And I think like emancipation, perhaps in the way that Dr. Spillers is talking about, is a questioning of what it means to be human, right? Like a questioning of ontology, a questioning of, what constitutes us as kind of human beings. And I think if we view abolition not as a kind of all-encompassing thing, but merely one of the tools and one of the strategies that we're using to spur forward that conversation about emancipation and what freedom could look like, then I feel like abolition then becomes questioning of this idea of violence as inevitability, right? So if we're thinking about emancipation as thinking about what constitutes us as human, we also have to, I think, in the context of Black death, in the context of ongoing violence, recognize that we need to get rid of or dismantle these ideas of violence as an inevitability, and the idea that prisons and policing and the state need to exist in order to curtail our human tendencies. And so I when I think of emancipation, I also think of no restraints. So freedom from racial capitalism, freedom from the promises of modernity, from the nation, from all of the boundaries that keep us subjugated. And I think what abolition is asking us at the very core is, how do we render the prison impossible? How do we make it unprofitable for them to continue, as one of the ways that we begin to ask those wider questions about the way that we want to live in the world? And I think of the way that abolition has kind of moved into mainstream space in this moment. And we're seeing more conversations, I think, just at a grassroots level about the ways that we could live differently. And that includes the feminist care ethic that was spoken about at the beginning of this conversation. This idea that as a community, we can hold each other accountable, that harm is not something that only needs to be dealt with after the fact. And I guess to close, I'll say, I've been thinking a lot in terms of abolition of what it would mean to demand justice in life, because often when we see Black death, when death happens, we're often called to demand justice in the form of jailing somebody or calling for somebody to lose their job, etc. And I think abolition asks us to understand that justice in life, we need to be orientated towards a living principle, if that makes sense. So we need to ensure that people have the conditions to mean that they can live life. And that to me is very closely connected to the idea of like the human, essentially, which I think is, what maybe Dr. Spillers was getting at. But
thank you, Lola. Che?
Yeah, it's such a provocative question about emancipation and its political grammar, and abolition and its political grammar. And I, like Lola, I guess I would say that I think of abolition as an emancipatory project, and in the words of Miriam Kaba, as a horizon. And my kind of political genealogy or coordinates, theoretical coordinates for abolition are really informed by Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work. And she often talks about abolition as a form of presence and presencing, and which means that it's not only an emancipatory struggle that has an outcome in the future, but to return to this question of temporality, it's an imminent one that's happening always already in the present. And that is about reconstructing our ways of being with each other. And finally, I guess another major figure for me would be Angela Davis's work on extending the definition and concept of abolition democracy and thinking about what she calls abolition feminism. So yeah, that's how I try and answer, and it's a great question.
Happy with those responses, Hortense Spillers? Yes, no, maybe?
Did you call me? Did you
I sure did, ma'am, I sure did. So
I really appreciate those responses. Because it's kind of rare to see that word used in preference to the emancipatory or emancipation. And so I just wondered, if there was something that I was missing in my understanding of the term. I guess when I think abolition, I'm thinking of an official act of extending or proffering something to someone who's passively waiting on the other end. But since you've introduced Ruth Gilmore to this discussion and Angela Davis, then that means that I will need to go back and see what they are also doing with the term and how that relates to the emancipatory. I just see the emancipatory until this discussion that we're having right now. I've always seen the emancipatory as very active people on the other end of an act, right? I mean, for instance, to my mind, there has never been among Black people a time when they were not in resistance to slavery, colonization, fascism, genocide, you name it. We've always been in resistance, always. There's never been, from that point of view, the beginning of a movement. There's always been a movement, there's always been resistance, there's always been somebody running away or somebody responding or somebody acting, somebody actively involved in acts of freedom. And so that's what I think about emancipation, that it had to come through official legislative channels, but at the same time that it was doing that, there were very active, resisting, some of them fugitive people on the other on the other end of the process. So what that involves is, to my mind, a kind of active interlocution between historical actors, and all of them acting in different spaces in different ways. Whereas before now, I had thought of abolition as kind of unilateral. And so that's why I put the question. So I really appreciate Lola and Shay's response to that. That helps a lot.
Well, thank you so much. And can I just say just very quickly that this is a model of how to be a scholar, folks, in terms of going, oh, I'm differently positioned in this Black radical tradition. These are not terms that I use. I want to think, I'm going to be humble and ask for clarification and then say, oh, I guess I need to go back and read Angela Davis. Because I think that's important because we have this idea, because abolition is very kind of fashionable now, but not all of us work in that tradition or come from that tradition, right? And I am also someone who uses the frame of emancipation and emancipatory work. And so I just think that kind of dance that needs to happen between different traditions that are all pushing in the same direction, but we are differently oriented to it, I think is just very, very important. So, all right, let's get on to some other questions here. As I said, you guys have some great questions, and they're very long questions, and so we're not gonna be able to get to all of this. But I do wanna pick up on this question about transnationalism, which I think will be very interesting and important. So this question is from Manishta, and I apologize if I'm butchering your name. Their question is, hi, I have a question. We're talking about the ethos of Black feminism and abolition. We've mentioned the US and the UK, but I was wondering if the speakers could expand on abolition, Black emancipation, and Black feminism in a transnational context, well, I guess clearly outside of the US or UK, because that's transnational, but that's another, but anyway, in a transnational context, for example, Lebanon, India, Latin America, that seems kind of a random connection, but a collection of places. But Zoe, can particularly because you're working on Namibia at the moment, can you talk about what all of this means, perhaps for the broader African diaspora or in other contexts?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about what, police abolition and prison abolition and kind of the abolition of carceral forms means for the continent, because, all of these different police forces as they exist are evolutions of colonial forces. Like, my family's from Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is going through some real pains around authoritarian violence. And, I have to think about the Zimbabwean police as being the origins were in the paramilitary groups that Cecil Rhodes created to defend the British South Africa Company. And so, I don't know specifically what a politic of abolition looks like in countries that are kind of fragile as they are. But I do know that, if we're talking about Black life, like, we have to think about these, we can't be enticed into thinking about into believing that Black leadership means a valuing of Black life, as we see with so many leaders on the continent, and as we saw with President Obama here in the United States. I think that we have to understand, like, the relationships between coloniality as we understood it formally and post-coloniality. Like, we have to understand how anti-Blackness exists in all of these different forms. Like, we have to have some, like, difficult conversations about indigeneity and African indigeneity, because we often make a lot of reference to having been indigenous once, but indigeneity kind of looks very different before and after independence and colonization. Yeah, I don't have very many answers other than the fact that it doesn't make sense to do Black feminism, to do kind of emancipatory or abolitionist, whatever your grammar is, work, if we're thinking about it purely locally. Because, racial capitalism does not stop at American borders. In fact, the United States is responsible for exporting so many kinds of violence and receiving so many other kinds of violence. We have to think about, like, Francophone and Lusophone and Hispanophone and all of these different parts of the Black world, and be very methodical about how we're thinking about the internationalism of these violences.
Yes, thank you so much, Zoe. Ms. Major, do you want to talk about any experiences you have in terms of working transnationally with different folks in terms of prison abolition? Oh, Oh, you're still muted, Miss Major. No, it's fine.
Okay. Yeah. I guess what I work with is the girls who come to this country from Africa and other places, and I indoctrinate them into what is considered the American culture. And I find that they are really receptive to that, and they want to change it to make it better. So that, of course, is the hard part about it, because their ethnic value of how to go about it is different than ours, say. But we can work it out and get together some sort of a cohesiveness to do it, you know. And in that sense, we move forward, and moving forward, we get it accomplished what we want to do. Yeah, that's the way we go about it.
And is that through a process of dialogue? So kind of bringing people together from different histories, different backgrounds, all that. How do you negotiate and reach that kind of consensus?
Well, what we do is at the Oasis that I have here, we sit and we talk about that. And it's a place where you can stress your views. Oh goodness, my battery is low.
Uh-oh. Wait, we'll keep talking. We'll maybe turn off your video. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay, my battery's low. But we in this space, we are able to discuss that, and it all matters to each other. You know, we have different points of view and different attitudes, but in a group setting and in a space that we have here, that we get it out and we work on it. We get it to understand that it's easier to do it in a context of all together rather than individual, you know. And so that works for us. Transgender, gender conforming, brown people, you know, it does work. And on occasion, it's hard in a sense, you know, because we have to fight the straight people. We have to fight the world in general. And so I stress to them that we have to always remember that we must fight. And it's not an easy fight. It depends upon, you know, what your opposition is. But to do something that you feel is safe to you, that you're able to do that and maintain. And keep in mind that when you get too tired, then come here and rejuvenate your batteries and go back out there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Miss Major.
Yeah.
Folks, we are running out, well, we are out of time because I promised this wouldn't, we're already over by 15 minutes and it's now 1/4 to the hour. So can I just actually ask Gail Lewis to comment finally on this issue of transnationalism? Because I do think, of course, you know, the dominance of the Anglophone world in terms of thinking about Black feminism is an ongoing issue and problem. And so we get it. So, but I think as someone who kind of worked in very smart ways to try to kind of think through transnationalism, can you kind of bring us on home with kind of thinking through?
No.
No, come on.
I certainly can't do that. I think Miss Major just did it. You know, when you need to come in and restore yourself, come home, come in and restore, and then go back out. So I think that's so key. I mean, I suppose, too many things to think about. I suppose where I stand now is trying to always be open to what I can learn from modes of resistance and opposition in other parts of the world. So somebody, I think when this question came up, somebody mentioned Lebanon. And I was thinking about how last year, when the Lebanese revolution was going on and the people were out in the streets in their thousands, they literally held hands from the southern end of the country right up to the north and did a human chain of connection right across the territory of Lebanon. It's a small, tiny country, a bit like holding hands across Jamaica. You know, it's that kind of thing. Okay, so it was massive. And what it did was, this was people who are riven, who did a, I don't know, was it a 15, 20-year civil war, killing each other, with the Israelis coming in and killing them and orchestrating killings and all that as well. But riven with sectarian divide. And the people were out in the streets saying, no, we no longer accept the terms of sectarian normativity. We don't accept it. And central to that chain, the chain of command, but central to that revolution was the huge mobilization of out queer people, trans people, and women saying we don't accept the gender normativities either. They were center, and they were old women and young women, they were old trans and young trans. There was a queering, if you like, of the revolution. And what that taught me was to always think about the need for our feminism to learn from other places, because we don't accept the nation state. I mean, we have to work within it, but that's one of the things we need to abolish. We need to abolish it in order to know that my hand can reach across to yours, and girl, you can teach me something. Boy, you can teach me something, and make my capacity to work together with you across in my local that becomes a placeholder for the unexpected, for the unknown, for the possible. In that sense, trans. And that's what I think happens. So Lebanon taught me that last year as well.
Oh, thank you. We're going to end on that note, folks, because that was absolutely incredible. Can you guys join me in thanking this incredible panel? Miss Major, Gail Lewis, Hortense, Zoe Samudzi. Thank you so much for this. This is absolutely incredible. Learned so much. And there are a couple of things in terms of what's happening next. And so I'm going to hand over to Lola, who's going to tell you a little bit about what's happening next week.
Yeah, it's only left to me to say thank you to our incredible panelists for their warmth and for their generative engagement. Thank you, Hortense, Gail, Zoe, Miss Major, and Akwugo for your excellent sharing as always. Thank you all for watching, and hopefully you'll join us again next week on August 10th for our second panel in this program, which is called Poetry is Not a Luxury, The Poetics of Abolition, with Sadiya Hartman, Kanisa Lubrin, Nat Raha, and Christina Sharp, which is going to be happening at 7 p.m. British Standard Time on Zoom. So yeah, thank you all so much for this conversation, and please do look out for the transcript and for the recorded conversation, which will be streaming, and we'll share those links.
Thank you, folks. Have a lovely night. Have a wonderful end of your day. Take care, you guys. Bye. 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 Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.